Officer David Harris thought he had put an activist in his place, shutting him down at a protest. A month later, that nobody became mayor and fired him. Now, David stood powerless before the man he once dismissed. What happened next would shock even those who had seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. Officer David Harris had spent 15 years on the force, and in his eyes, protests were all the same: loud, disruptive, and ultimately meaningless. He had no patience for activists who thought they could change the system by chanting slogans and waving signs. Order was what kept society intact, and order required control. That afternoon, the demonstration in downtown had been mostly uneventful. A few hundred people filled the streets, holding banners and demanding justice, but nothing Harris hadn't seen before. He stood at the edge of the crowd, scanning for potential troublemakers, when his attention locked onto a young black man standing on a makeshift stage. The man held a megaphone, his voice cutting through the noise. "We don't want violence. We want change." Harris felt an immediate irritation, but he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the man spoke, not with anger, not with desperation, but with certainty. He wasn't pleading for change. He was demanding it. And the people listened. Harris's grip on his baton tightened. His job wasn't to debate politics. It was to maintain order. And order meant shutting this down. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the dirty looks and murmurs as he approached the stage. "Step down!" His voice was sharp, authoritative. He expected obedience. The man didn't move. He held Harris's gaze, unwavering. "We have the right to protest." It wasn't what he said that set Harris off. It was the way he said it. Calm, steady, like he wasn't afraid. A flicker of something ugly rose in Harris's chest. He didn't hesitate. He reached out, grabbed the man's arm, and yanked him down. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps, shouts, people pulling out their phones. "What the hell are you doing?" someone yelled. The man barely resisted, but Harris forced him down anyway. He wanted to make a point, to remind him who was in control. Cameras flashed. People screamed. But as Harris locked eyes with the man beneath him, he saw something he didn't expect. Not fear, not panic, determination. Elijah Carter. A name David Harris had barely registered when he made the arrest. Just another activist looking for attention, he had thought. But within hours, that name was everywhere. News stations ran the footage on a loop. Harris yanking Elijah from the stage, slamming him down, pressing his knee against his back while the crowd screamed. Headlines condemned the brutality. Social media exploded with outrage, and protesters swarmed the police station, demanding action. Harris, however, felt untouchable. He had been a cop for 15 years, had written reports to justify far worse incidents, had watched officers get away with things much bigger than this. He wasn't worried. But this time, something was different. The backlash didn't fizzle out. It grew. "Elijah Carter did nothing wrong," shouted a news anchor. Harris scoffed at the television. "The guy's a troublemaker." But even as he said it, he noticed the shift around him. His fellow officers weren't defending him like they usually did. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. No pats on the back, no quiet reassurances. The department issued a vague statement about reviewing protocol, the kind of non-committal response they used when they wanted the outrage to die down. Except it didn't. Then came the moment Harris least expected. Elijah Carter walked out of jail the next morning, stepped in front of the cameras, and announced his candidacy for mayor. Harris laughed out loud. Like he has a chance. A protester with a criminal record running for office? It was ridiculous. No one would take it seriously. But then the headlines changed. Not about Harris, not about the arrest, about Elijah. His background as a lawyer, His years of fighting wrongful convictions, his work in the community. The laughter didn't last long. Rallies started popping up across the city. People weren't just supporting him. They were rallying behind him. Every debate, every speech, his numbers climbed. At first, Harris ignored it. Then, he dismissed it. But as the weeks passed, he could no longer deny it. Elijah Carter wasn't just running, he was winning. David Harris had always believed that men like Elijah Carter didn't last long in the real world. Idealists talked a big game, but when it came down to it, the system always won. That was the way things worked. That was the way things were supposed to work. But now, Elijah Carter's face was everywhere. Billboards, campaign ads, television debates. His voice echoed across the city. Town halls overflowed with people, hanging on to every word he spoke. Real justice, real accountability. The crowd roared in agreement, their applause deafening. David watched in silent rage as Elijah transformed from a protester in handcuffs to a political force that no one could ignore. The same city that had once backed its police force without question was now calling for reform, calling for change, calling for his head. At first, David dismissed it. Politicians made promises all the time, and people loved a good redemption story. But as the weeks passed, he felt the shift. The police department, the very institution he had devoted his life to, was treating him like a liability. His own people were backing away. They called it a precaution when they put him on unpaid leave, said it was just to keep things calm. But David knew what it really was. A warning. A step toward cutting him loose completely. They were turning on him. He slammed the remote onto the table, glaring at the latest campaign ad. Elijah, smiling, confident, powerful. "They're making me the bad guy," David muttered, his voice sharp with frustration. His wife, who had sat quietly through his rants, finally spoke. "Maybe you are." The words hit like a punch to the gut. He turned to her, ready to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't saying it to provoke him. She was saying it because she had considered it. David sat in silence. For the first time in his life, doubt crept in. And then, election night came. David watched, unmoving, as the final results rolled in. The cheers erupted outside. Fireworks lit up the skyline. Elijah Carter had just been declared the new mayor. David sat frozen, staring at the screen. His career, his power, was over. David Harris had never been summoned like this before. He walked into the police commissioner's office, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. Whatever this was, he wasn't going down without a fight. The commissioner sat behind his desk, expression unreadable. A single sheet of paper lay between them. "Officer Harris," the man said, sliding the document forward. David's eyes flicked down. Termination letter. His body went rigid, heat rising to his face. He gritted his teeth. "This is a joke." He had given 15 years to this department. He had done what was necessary to keep order, to maintain control. And this was how they repaid him? Before the commissioner could respond, another voice filled the room. "No, Officer Harris." David turned sharply. Elijah Carter stepped inside, moving with the same quiet confidence that had made him so infuriating on that stage. The same calm, unwavering presence that had made the crowd listen to him, believe in him. Now, he was standing here, not as a protester, not as an activist, as the mayor. David shot to his feet, fists clenched, his breath heavy with restrained anger. He could feel the injustice of it all choking him. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply met David's glare with the same steady, collected gaze he had given him that day at the protest. It's called consequences. The words cut deep. David's mouth opened, but no words came. For years, he had believed men like Elijah Carter were insignificant, powerless, just noise in the background of a world that would never truly change. And yet, here he was, standing above him, deciding his fate. David had spent his career looking down on men like Elijah Carter. And now, Elijah Carter was looking down on him. David Harris was no longer an officer, no longer a man of authority. He was nobody.